Okay, it's 10. Running while listening to Spotify. Let's see if this works. Quite sunny. It's 3 p.m. Saturday afternoon.
Which do you have?
We just had our number 5 and 6. So we just had twins, and we started with twins. So now we have 6 kids, 2 sets of twins, and then 2 individual kids.
Oh yeah, so you twins. That'll get you all in real quick. And
Yeah.
So
Yeah. It's kind of a nice bookend because you start with twins, and I think this is
right.
This is probably our end point. But who knows? It's all God's will. But it's been it's been great.
How old are your kids?
They range in age from 9. The oldest twins are 9 years old. They're about to turn 10 at the end of this month, and then down to 4 months old. So we haven't hit the 10.
So you're pretty busy on the family front. Yeah. Okay. And you've got plenty to preoccupy yourself in the social world, and things are going well for you with Daily Wire.
They are. It's been the podcast that I do. My show has really has gained a lot of traction, especially over the last year. Now, not that it all started over the last year, but that's really when the film came out. That was kind of another watershed moment in my career personally. So it's been fantastic.
How many subscribers are you up to on YouTube?
Well, we're at we're over 2 million, and I'm not sure what the exact number is. But then we got
over 2.
Yeah, over 2 million, and then but then we got hit with the demonetization. This was, we were growing rapidly, and it kind of felt like, because we know how big tech works, and it just we were sort of expecting it, growing too fast, and it's like we're kind of sticking our head up above all the other weeds that are going to notice us and try to cut us back down to size, which is basically what they did with demonetization.
And now, are you still demonetized?
Say it again?
Are you still demonetized?
Yeah, the demonetization, I don't know exactly how it works, but they put you on some sort of probationary period where they demonetize you, and then if you have any more violations, then it's a permanent demonetization, or they can kick you off the platform entirely. I mean, all these the rules for all these companies, but especially on YouTube, the rules are intentionally vague and very opaque, and so you're never sure. They never told us exactly what I even said that was allegedly in violation of the rules, but we do know that it's all sort of in the vein of quote unquote misgendering. It all has to do with trans.
Oh yeah, misgendering. Yeah. Well, they demonetized my daughter, I think, for 2 years, and we never had any idea why. They've left me alone, which is kind of strange, because I've gone after the trans activists with, tong and hammer as hard as I possibly could. I probably said the harshest things I've ever said in public about anyone, about the trans activists, and yet YouTube hasn't touched me, and so God only knows why that is. And like you said, the rules are vague and arbitrary, and so
yeah, I think they realize that they can't, because I had thought the same thing about myself up until this moment. I'd see other people get demonetized, suspended from all these platforms, and I think, why haven't they gone after me yet? Because I'm saying things that are at least as quote unquote offensive as them. I think it's just they realize that they can't. If they try to just wipe out all conservatives or anybody on the right, they try to wipe them all out at once. That's not going to work for them. So they just kind of pick. It's like every year they have a new person that they pick to make an example of, and so this year it was me.
Yeah. Well, on YouTube, I called for the liars and butchers who are pushing the trans surgery agenda and the counselors that are facilitating them to be imprisoned, and called them criminal. And so I could do that again. I think they're criminal and that they should be imprisoned. And yet YouTube has pretty much decided not to pursue me. And I suppose I'm guilty of dead naming people like Will Thomas as well. And so, but. And that's got me in trouble on Twitter, although that, as you know, ended up working in my favor eventually. So let's talk about your documentary to begin with. What is a woman? And so that's caused all sorts of misery and grief around the world, and made people happy as well to have someone finally come out and make what was essentially a kind of black comedy about this preposterous state of affairs that we happen to find ourselves in. And so tell us about the genesis of the idea and why you thought that was your problem. You know, people ask me, well, why does this trans thing bother you? Why do you care? Like, you know, what's up with you? Why can't you just leave these poor people alone? And I mean, my answer to that is because they're cutting the musculature off the forearms of children to build penises that don't work. That's one of the reasons that I can't leave it alone. There's many others which we could get to, but in your situation, why did you decide to go after this particular topic? Why did it grip you?
I think, well, the reason that you gave is a very good one. The fact that they're mutilating kids. Like, you really don't need... there are so many reasons why this issue matters and we ought to be engaged on it. But you don't actually need to go past the simple fact that they're mutilating and butchering and abusing kids. So that is one of the motivations for me. On a personal level, the fact that I am a dad, and I do have 6 kids, 4 kids at the time when we started making the film. But the fact that my kids are inheriting this culture that has forgotten some of the most basic facts of reality is really distresses me and troubles me. And I hear stories all the time, and I'm sure you hear these stories too, constantly from parents of usually, you know, kids are a little bit older than mine, adolescent kids. They go off to school, they come home, and almost seemingly out of nowhere, the child is a new person, is totally transformed for the worse. Doesn't, you know, maybe your daughter comes home, declares, oh, I'm a boy. And then I've heard these kinds of stories so many times, and it's terrifying, it's harrowing. And so just on a personal level, I'm worried about my kids being in that kind of environment. But then also underneath all of that, you know, there's what this does to kids. There's the fact that opportunities are being taken away from women, and women are being, you know, they're being degraded by this and dehumanized by it, and all of that, appropriated, their identity appropriated. All that is true, but what is underneath it, the underlying issue under all of that is that this is just an attack on truth itself. So the reason why I really care about it, first and foremost, is that it's not true. Like, we are being told that we must accept something that is not true, that we must go along with something that is not true. And I care about the truth, because if you don't care about the truth, then what's the point of anything? Like, what's the point of anything that we're doing or saying or any of that if we're willing to discard the truth? And when I first noticed this trans issue becoming kind of mainstream, which was probably around, you know, it's hard to pinpoint a year, but 2014, 2015, around the time when Bruce Jenner, you know, declared himself, Caitlyn Jenner was crowned Woman of the Year. I think that was kind of the, that's not where all this started, but that was the moment, if there was one particular moment, where it surged into the mainstream. And I remember that quite vividly, and I also remember being distressed by the fact that so many people who I thought were on my side thought that this was kind of a sideshow distraction. They didn't think it would go anywhere. They thought it was a fad. It wasn't important. There were a lot of conservatives who just went along with it because they were trying to be polite. And
yeah, well, conservatives do that a lot.
They do, and it's unfortunate because it's like in some ways it's a good impulse that you want to be polite, you have good intentions, you don't want to be mean to somebody, you don't want to make them feel bad, and those good intentions are exploited to a great extent by the left. But that was when I noticed people on the right completely dropping the ball on this subject, or refusing to pick up the ball to begin with. Like, they didn't want to play this game at all. That's when I felt personally compelled to, step up.
Whether you're feeling stressed, anxious, or simply seeking a moment of peace and tranquility, the Hallow app has something for you. Hallow offers an incredible range of guided meditations and prayers that are designed to help you deepen your spirituality and strengthen your connection to God. With Hallow, you can explore different themes and types of prayer and meditation, such as gratitude, forgiveness, and centering prayer. You can also choose from different lengths of meditation to fit your schedule, whether you have a few minutes or an hour. With its user-friendly interface and hundreds of guided meditations, the Hallow app has quickly become a go-to resource for people seeking spiritual growth and healing. Download the app for free at hallow.com/Jordan. You can set prayer reminders and track your progress along the way. Halo is truly transformative and will help you connect with your faith on a deeper level. So what are you waiting for? Download the Halo app today at halo.com/Jordan. That's halo.com/Jordan. Once again, it's halo.com/Jordan for an exclusive 3-month free trial of all 6,000 plus prayers and meditations.
And is that when you started to lay the groundwork for making the film? When did you actually start working on the film proper?
It would have been about a year and a half before it came out, so it would have been in like mid-2021. The groundwork for the film, though, was just this question, which obviously I didn't invent the question, what is a woman, but it occurred to me.
Well, it's such a stupid question. I mean, the fact that we have to ask that question. You know, I was looking at this on the biological front. So, sex is older than nervous systems by almost 1 billion years. That's how fundamental it is. It's probably more fundamental as a biological reality than up or down. In terms of the stable phenomena that our nervous systems have actually adapted to. I think you could make a very strong case that there is no bit of reality that's more bedrock than sexual differentiation. Not least because any organism that propagates itself sexually, and that's pretty much any complex organism for all sorts of complicated reasons, if an organism can't tell the difference between its sex and the opposite sex, then it doesn't propagate. And so failure to propagate might constitute the most fundamental of category errors, right, in any biological sense. And so if you do believe that there's biological reality at all, which the hedonistic, narcissistic, postmodern types like to deny, although good luck to them, you have to believe in the bedrock reality of sex. And to overlay that notion of mutable gender on top of it is, well, it's quite the piece of sleight of hand. We could talk about that a little bit because, you know, there are men with feminine temperaments and women with masculine temperaments. That's within the realm of human variability, but that has virtually no bearing on the issue of biological sex. You know, I told the bloody Senate here in Canada too, in Canada, which has gone woke in a way that, you know, puts San Francisco to shame. I told them in no uncertain terms that they were going to produce a psychological epidemic. Because I knew the literature on psychological epidemics, which has been traced back about 300 years, not least by a man named Henry Ellenberger, who wrote a great book called The Discovery of the Unconscious. Multiple personality disorder, for example, is cycled as a psychological epidemic for almost 300 years. And there's been epidemics of cutting and bulimia and anorexia and Tourette's. In very recent years, there was an epidemic of paranoia about satanic ritual daycare abuse back in the 80s, and that really got seriously out of hand. There's a great book on that topic called Satan's Silence that was written by a lawyer and a social worker detailing out the absolute hysteria that emerged around the possibility that children were being abused, you know, in these underground caverns underneath towns by their daycare personnel. The FBI invented an entire new category of sex criminal, by the way, a category that doesn't exist, which is late onset female serial sexual abuser. Right? That doesn't exist. That doesn't happen. And so I knew that the possibility of psychological epidemic was real, and the best way to cause a psychological epidemic is to confuse young women in particular, because as a general rule, it's young women who are prone to psychological epidemics for whatever reason. Higher levels of negative emotion, I would say, and probably earlier onset of puberty and more dramatic transformation. All of that seems to tie together to make young women in particular more susceptible to psychological epidemics. But, you know, nonetheless, we've run down that road like mad, and now we have a psychological epidemic on our hands. And of course, what's happening on the ideological front is that all the people who deny that an epidemic is occurring say, no, we've just freed people to pursue their own identity, and now they don't have to be afraid of being who they are, which is, of course, I can tell you partly why that's false, by the way. So about 20% thereabouts of young people now hypothetically identify as somewhere on the LGBT, etc. alphabet spectrum. And but there's no indication that their actual sexual behavior has changed. You know, so if you look at the girls, for example, who identify as bisexual, and I suppose that's the most common of the identity transformations, they're no more likely to have had a same-sex partner than they were 25 years ago. That's pretty interesting, eh? Because you'd think that human sexual behavior might be mutable because of social pressure to some degree, and you know, what you say about yourself, that's obviously more susceptible to psychological pressure than what you do. But you might expect that what you do would move a little bit, but I haven't seen any evidence at all that actual sexual practices among young people have changed, except that there's pretty compelling data to suggest that young people are actually having a lot less sex than they were, say, 20 years ago. And that's reached epidemic proportions in places like Japan and South Korea. And so, anyways, you know, these are all the fun things that happen when you start blurring the distinction between men and women, and then, of course, confusing kids who are already hyper confused because of where they are in their developmental progression. All right, so you started laying the groundwork for the movie. How did the vision take shape? Like, what did you think you were doing to begin with, and how did that change as you pursued the topic?
Well, it all centered around this question. And by the way, just to say one other thing about this, about the rise in these LGBT identities. And as you point out, I mean, they claim that, well, it's not a social contagion, right? They were always there. It's just that they were hiding in the closet and they weren't free to come out. Well, the point that I always like to make here is that, and it's a little morbid, I suppose, but you know, keep in mind that what the left also tells us is that if we do not aggressively affirm people who identify as trans, or really anyone in the LGBT, under the LGBT umbrella, if we don't aggressively and like systematically affirm these people, then we're going to have suicides and they're going to kill themselves. Well, so what that should tell us then is that well, if you go back through history, and according to them, there were millions and millions every year, millions of trans people who were just not out in the open because they weren't being affirmed. Well, then we should be able to see through history just a terrible epidemic of suicide the world over, especially among kids, because they were always...
Especially among kids who would also claim in their suicide notes that the reason they killed themselves because they had an identity that was cross-sexual that wasn't being affirmed.
And that didn't happen. And in fact, if any data I've ever looked at, childhood suicide in particular was pretty unheard of until recently. So this is it's a terrible epidemic and a recent one. So that's one of the points to make there. But in terms of the film, I think we wanted to structure it all around this really basic question of what is a woman, because it occurred to me a couple of years before we started making the film that this is, it's a very basic question. It's a very simple question. It's the kind of question that we shouldn't have to ask. It's the sort of question that the answer is so obvious that some people struggle with it just because of that, because it's so innate that you don't stop to think about it. But it is the simplicity is that's where you find the beauty and the power in the question. Rather than making arguments at the other side, it's like you're giving the floor to them and you're saying, okay, you're claiming this and this. Well, tell me more about that. So when a man says, I identify as a woman, I can respond and say, well, you're not a woman and here are my reasons. More powerful response is to say, oh, you're a woman. What do you mean by that? What do you mean you identify as a woman? What are you trying to say exactly? That's all that question is really accomplishing is just, it's really giving the floor back to the other side and saying, explain to us what you mean by that. And they're not able to do it. And if you can demonstrate that they themselves can't explain their own ideas and their own claims, then it's pretty much over. There's nothing else to say. They've exposed their own ideas as a
There's also something else that's stunningly immature and pathological about that whole problem. And I'm deeply ashamed of my colleagues on the psychological front, especially clinical psychologists who've been silent during this, because clinical psychology is actually a pretty rigorous discipline, at least at the high end. It was very difficult to obtain graduate training as a clinical psychologist, to get into a research-oriented Boulder, Colorado model clinical program. You had to be able to do scientific research and publish and become a clinical practitioner. Unlike medicine, like people think of physicians as scientists, but they're not. They don't publish, they don't analyze the scientific research, they don't know how to do statistics, they don't know how to read scientific papers. They're not scientists, whatever else they might be. Clinical psychologists are scientists, and they were practitioners. And clinical psychologists also not only know with 100% certainty that subjectively defined identity, that identity isn't subjectively defined, they're actually bound by their own code of ethics to reject subjective identification as a diagnostic, what would you say, certainty. So for example, I'm bound by my code of ethics if you come to me with a claim even that you're depressed, to assess that depression using multiple different methods. They have to be qualitatively different methods. And I have to see that there's convergence across multiple methods before I can accept your self, let's say, your self-identification, your subjective claim. And the reason that that's the case among psychologists is because we know that mere self-report, which is the technical term for it, isn't. You can rely on it if you have absolutely no other evidence, but it's incumbent upon you to try to gather other evidence. And so if you're diagnosing someone, you can be hauled in front of your disciplinary committees for only relying on subjective self-report. But now, as a clinical psychologist, guided, let's say, by the American Psychological Association ethical guidelines, you have to transgress against one or other set of guidelines because you are compelled by the new guidelines and also by law in most state and provinces to accept subjective identification, and yet you're bound by the other set of ethical codes not to, because you have to use multiple converging methods to diagnose. And so that's put clinicians in an impossible situation. You know, they're damned if they do and damned if they don't, and I can understand why they're silent, but they shouldn't be, because the contradiction is obvious. And there's one other thing too. So the notion that identity, I'm a woman because I say I am, the idea that identity is self-proclaimed is also utterly preposterous, and every psychologist who isn't a moron knows this. And the reason for that is that you have to negotiate your identity with other people. In fact, the entire process of establishing a harmonious relationship with another person, whether it's a friend or a wife or a husband, a child, a parent, a business colleague, a stranger on the street, every single interaction you have socially is a negotiation of your subjective identity. And if you're someone who says, I am exactly what I say I am, even though that can shift from moment to moment, and you have to play along even though you don't know the rules. First of all, if you're a child, you're the kind of child who's going to be unpopular, and psychologists should know that because Jean Piaget documented that extensively. And secondly, that's a form of psychopathology because it's narcissistic and psychopathic and self-centered to the point where there's no way you can establish a reasonable relationship with anyone. And all psychologists who aren't utterly incompetent know that, and yet are, in the main, 100% silent on this issue. And that's despite the fact that these kids, for example, are being lied to by extraordinarily badly trained psychotherapists and then butchered by, well, surgeons who are, you know, acting out a degree of self-centered, greedy virtue signaling that I think is actually unparalleled in the annals of medical malpractice. And that's something to say, given that there were no shortage of physicians involved in the Nazi atrocities. So anyway, that's just a shout out to all my colleagues who are remaining silent while all of this is transpiring on the public front. All right, so now you went out, you talked to a bunch of professionals, academics and so forth, and you asked this question, what is a woman? And your documentary is interesting because there's a serious element to it, because you're posing this question, but there's also a satirical and tongue-in-cheek element to it. And I didn't know what to make when I watched the documentary to begin with, because it had this kind of satirical edge. But I've come to realize more recently that almost everything that's happening in our culture has a satirical edge, and that's probably true of authoritarian totalitarianism in general. You know, I started to understand that that's why the figure of the evil clown is such a common trope in fiction, is that when you get a rise in totalitarian ideology, you get a concomitant rise in, what would you say, the dominion of the evil clown, and everything turns into a parody. And there was certainly an element of that in your film. You know, I mean, I was watching you interview professors and so forth, and it's so preposterous that, well, it looked at times that you were having a difficult time believing that you were doing this, or even sometimes keeping a straight face. And so what was that experience like?
Yeah, it's interesting too, because the original movie, the way that I conceived it, would have been even more satirical. I think I originally thought of this as a fully satirical, almost in a certain way playing a character almost, as someone who's bought into this stuff, and I'm getting these people to keep talking. And we kind of, as we began to film it, we started to see it differently, where we needed, and so if you watch the movie, you can tell it's like almost exactly halfway through, there's this kind of tonal shift as we get into the more serious conversations. And we had to have that there because some of this stuff that's happening is so horrifically evil that there's no way that I can see to make it funny or anything. We have to be willing to stare right into that darkness. But then I didn't want to lose the satirical part of it either, because it is also true. Although this stuff is horrifically evil, it's also absurd. It is completely absurd. And we have to point that out. And I think that's one of the first mistakes that we made. When I say we, I mean, you know, the people that Team Sanity, the people who know better. One of the first mistakes we made was in thinking that the last thing we can do is ridicule any of this, because that's too mean. I know we need to ridicule it, and it's not about ridiculing individual people who are confused or mentally ill or struggling. Ridiculing the idea, the notion, the claims that are being made. And if any individuals are being ridiculed, it's the people who know better and are out there propagating this stuff. Like, you know, we talked to a doctor in the film, and who's a proponent of this stuff and transing the kids, and she's involved in that. And the conversation devolves into this stuff about does a chicken have a gender, and can a male chicken lay eggs? It gets really, really absurd, and she becomes kind of the butt of the joke. But that's her fault. It's because her own position is so ridiculous that it gets exposed that way.
The leading cause for death among infants in the U.S. and the world is abortion. Sadly, with the abortion pill accounting for over 50% of all abortions, babies' lives are at an even greater risk. In the midst of this awful tragedy, we can do something about it thanks to our new partners at Preborn's network of clinics. Preborn clinics stand strong, offering love, support, and compassion to hurting women, helping them to make the right choice. By letting a woman see her baby with a free ultrasound and hear the heartbeat, a baby's chance at life is doubled. These clinics provide mothers who choose life with maternity and baby clothes, diapers, car seats, counseling, and much more. All of these services are provided free of charge, and up to 2 years of assistance is granted. So join us in the fight to save these precious lives. This year, Jordan Peterson's listeners have a goal to save 11,000 babies. One ultrasound is $28, and any donation amount will help and is tax deductible. To donate, dial pound 250 and say the keyword baby. That's pound 250 baby. Or go to preborn.com/Jordan. That's preborn.com/Jordan. We are the answer to save these lives. Dial now.
You know, I'm dubious about one of the claims that you just made, and I think maybe this has to do again with the intrinsic politeness of conservatives. And by the way, politeness technically is an element of agreeableness on the personality temperament front, and politeness is a predictor of conservative belief. And so the idea that conservatives are polite actually turns out to be technically true. I actually believe that a fair number of the individuals who are involved in this actually deserve to be called out and satirized and actually punished for their actions. And so, as you may know or may remember, I got kicked off of Twitter because I went after Elliot Page. And I went after Elliot Page, who I actually have a fair bit of sympathy for, you know, as an individual, because my sense is that Ellen Page, never found love in a manner that enabled her to fully appreciate what she was as a woman. And I don't know why that happened or why she wasn't unable to deliver that to herself. But as a clinician, I have a fair bit of sympathy for that, because it's pretty damn awful to be so at odds with yourself that the solution to your misery is mutilation. And then I went after her on Twitter, talking about the criminal physician that cut off her breasts and the sin of pride, and that's why I got kicked off Twitter. And I got a lot of grief about that from friends and from the general public and from my own licensing board, which is trying to remove my license in Ontario at the moment, although they're not having a lot of luck with that, in no small part because of that tweet, because I miss, what do they call that, dead named Elliot Page by using her name Ellen, which is her name. And the reason I went after her is because she paraded her new chest in a fashion magazine and got 1.5 million Instagram likes. And she's a star and has a fair bit of influence, and she's a model, because that's what a star is. A star is a model for emulation and imitation, for emulation and imitation and admiration. And she misused that position to advertise this mutilation and to contribute to the misery of foolish young women who are misguided, who are doing things to themselves that will be atrocious and permanent. And so I felt she had crossed the line from victim to perpetrator and deserved a fair bit of trouble for her foolishness. And then I also think the same about Will Thomas and Dylan Mulvaney. And I think as individuals, they deserve a fair bit of negative public attention, no shortage of satire. But I look at Will Thomas. I talked to Ryder Gaines. I released a podcast with Ryder Gaines, the swimmer who, one of the swimmers who was forced, compelled, and chose to swim against Will Thomas, this 6'4", man with 3-foot shoulders who was crushing the women in all sorts of different subdivisions of swimming championships. And he is so bent that it's almost incomprehensible from a psychological perspective. I mean, you think about what you have to be like to be a 6'4" man who was competing among other men, who wasn't doing that great a job of it at a professional level. I think he was ranked 462nd, who then decided he was a woman, even though he only took vague and tentative steps in that direction, and then competed against women, and then took their trophies, and then paraded himself as a hero among victims, and aggrandized himself narcissistically while he was stealing from these women who were obviously
Is it?